Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. This show was recorded live on USC's campus.
My name is Robin Craig. I'm a law professor at the USC Gould School of Law. My specialty is environmental and natural resources law, with a specialty within that of water law. So I teach actual water law, the water rights, property rights in water. I teach ocean and coastal law, and I do water pollution with a focus on the Clean Water Act and how it's implemented.
Very nice. My name is Sean Hyde. I'm a business strategy professor at the Marshall School of Business. I primarily focus in two sectors: energy broadly, which includes electron generation, as well as petroleums, fossil fuel, hydrocarbons, and then also agribusiness as a secondary sector. Focusing a lot on like food certification and the input outputs into like the agriculture. So that's the agribusiness arm of it. So
can you tell me each a little bit about how the issues currently plaguing the American Southwest, specifically the interstate fights over limited water resources and rapidly dwindling water resources at that, how that is covered through your work?
Okay. Well, water law is the law that created the law of the river. So it's inherently part of what I do. Part of the law of the Colorado River is law going back to 1922. And in the West, we have a system of property rights based on prior appropriation, which once a right is created, as long as it's continued to be used in a non-wasteful and beneficial way, it endures forever. So we've got a lot of water rights. They tend to be very large water rights locked up, a lot of them in agriculture. About 80% of the water rights in the Southwest are for agriculture and Mountain West. And that plays into how flexible you can be in the Colorado River water distribution. So California has kind of the lion's share of water out of the Colorado River system because it was first in time and had the political clout to make that happen. But when you think about trying to redistribute water, at the 7-state level for the Colorado River, it becomes a major legal and political battle to try and redistribute water. But if you also think about the people within each state who are dependent on that water, you have to get very creative to try and find a politically palatable way to free up water. Mostly, I think there's a lot of creative solutions that haven't been explored with respect to freeing up some water from agriculture, which mostly just takes money, which in this realm is usually the least problematic thing to come up with. And so that's how I get into it, is just we have this very old and fairly rigid set of laws governing how that water is distributed at a time when we need maximum flexibility to figure out what actually would be the highest best use of that water.
I've got a couple of projects that tag onto this, and I can also talk about the agriculture, what we're seeing, at least in those trends in the agribusiness. The first two, looking at the hydropower industry in the United States, which is completely reliant upon the amount of water that we need here. What we've seen is like a decline in this hydropower production over the last 7 years, actually over a decade, but the last 7 years have been quite dramatic. And it's led to the point where now the seasonality of hydropower is become a big issue. And what we've seen then is that utilities have to reshuffle now their portfolio, moving away from hydropower. And when I think about hydropower here, most of this is big hydro, which is from the reservoirs, right? We do have run of the river, but the seasonality with run of the river is even higher than the reservoir-based hydroelectric. And with that, right, we're seeing the shuffling, and the research that I've seen and the work that I've done shows that most of it's gone to coal. Actually, coal has had this uprising in generation because of the loss of hydropower, and mainly in the Western United States. So, and this is, and we've seen this drought conditions, not just here in the United States, but we're seeing this also play out in Europe. They had a big year of drought, which affected not only their hydropower production, but also transportation of goods. Germany is heavily dependent upon a canal system for moving their goods. They used that, even though they could have used trains, they actually invested more in their canal system for their major transport. Even to this day, they use that. So that became a big problem for them. And the other thing that's also an issue, which Robin brought up here, is this idea that the prior appropriation laws and the varying degrees to which states use them. And she's the expert, she could talk about this, but I'll probably ask her some questions on this. But I've got this project on geothermal power. And one of the interesting things about geothermal power is when this technology came out and, well, developed in California first, the United States, and the geysers region in the 1960s, it was a brand new technology that had yet to been codified into law. And so they didn't know quite exactly how they should codify it, how they should classify the technology. And you saw some states move forward, like California, one of the first, and they classified this as like a mineral right. So it kind of fell under the energy law, sort of like oil and gas. But then you have like other states who kind of moved in, and this is the stuff we're kind of working at to try to see like what led to some of these legislative classifications, who classified it as water, right? Well, the problem is when you classify a good like that as water, then it falls under the water law. And as Robin said, some states have very stringent prior appropriation laws. Well, what does that do? That creates a barrier for this geothermal development in some of these states. And so this is actually a thing that I find in this data that we're exploring. We're looking at the intersection also of like water law with this classification of the geothermal. And so, yeah, this has created an unintended problem with the development of geothermal resources throughout the United States. And by the way, just to give you a quick anecdote, like at least as far as I know, and Robin can maybe clarify this, I believe Colorado has one of the most stringent prior appropriation laws in the states. Or if I understand this right, like I think once the rain hits your roof, it's no longer yours, right? It belongs to the state. And so I can't even store it in a barrel, technically, but legally, right? Well, Colorado also has the largest amount of geothermal resources that can be explored and exploited at a very low cost, right? Yet it doesn't have any geothermal activity or geothermal plant whatsoever. And a lot of it's been due to the fact that they classify this as geothermal resource as a water, and it falls under their water law, which prohibits any type of exploration and development in this area. So you can see like, these things are kind of like intersecting the energy and the water, particularly in the geothermal, but also we're seeing this negative effect right now in hydropower.
Yeah, so Sean, I completely agree. Yes, Colorado is what is considered the classic prior appropriation state. Basically, every drop of water is accounted for from the moment it falls from the sky. And yeah, rain barrels even are prohibited. Actually, Utah had the same rule. Utah is probably the second most classic prior appropriation state. It had the same rule on rain barrels, although it finally loosened up legislatively, and you can store a small amount of water in rain barrels. But that tells you how strapped the state is. Colorado also has a complete conjunctive management of its surface water and groundwater. And that's why geothermal ended up as part of the entire system, because everything is managed conjunctively. And if you can't get those water rights that for the most part are committed to someone, the water's destined for someone already, you're putting a limit on that resource, which means unfortunately that two of our water-based renewable energy sources are both strapped. The hydropower, people in the West forget how much hydropower plays into renewable energy and just base energy to begin with, and why, for example, Pacific Northwest has historically had very low electricity costs. But when the water is getting more variable, and when we're looking at those major reservoirs on the Colorado potentially hitting dead pool, bad for water, but also means nothing's coming through the dams to generate electricity. So and the fact that a lot of the replacement energy is coal means that this is one of the key water energy nexuses, and climate as well, is while we're trying to get a grip on climate change and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, the easiest replacement source of energy still in the United States is a coal-fired power plant. Unfortunately, hopefully that'll change in the near future. And so it's just an example of the cascades of follow-on effects from overusing our water, basically having too many people for the water that has ever been there, and now definitely for the decreasing supply.
Yeah, and just on that, Robin, that's the one thing I brought up a couple times with Nina, is that it's amazing in the state of California that we haven't built any reservoirs since the 1970s, even though the population has over doubled, right? And it seems like we get a lot of water, and this is maybe a topic we can bring up. I guess Governor Newsom uses emergency powers finally to say we're going to store a little bit more water this year, given that we have this rain, instead of dumping it into the San Joaquin Delta or whatever for the smelt. So this is a big question, in an issue. I think in California we have the ability to store it. I just don't think we have the political will, and we have the ability to recycle water in this state. We don't have the political will, and to desalinate, and we don't have the political will. So we're in this situation where we're just running out of water, and
well, the political will on desal can change in a heartbeat. I was in Santa Barbara for one of the big droughts in the 1980s, 1990s, and desal became palatable to Santa Barbara very quickly when you're watching Lake Cachuma disappear before Santa Barbara was hooked up to the state water system, which is not a reliable source of water anymore either. But yeah, so I think the political will on desal is slowly going to change back. I mean, California had a plan for desal before the housing crisis, and I think it's going to become increasingly necessary to go that route. Storage, it can get a little trickier. A lot of the good, quote unquote, best dam sites have already been built out. And so you're looking at aquifer recovery. And Orange County does a lot of that to its credit and does a very good job of it. But there's some other issues that can come up with aquifer storage and recovery. California is blessed with having some pretty good aquifers that don't contribute bad things to the water when you put it back in. But like Florida ran into all sorts of arsenic contamination when it tried to use aquifer storage and recovery. The reuse, if you're a coastal city, Los Angeles is now committed to reusing the water, reclaiming the water that would have gone to the ocean. If you're a coastal city, legally, that's relatively easy. But if you're an internal city, somebody downstream is depending on your return flow. That's the interconnectedness of the prior appropriation. So you can't just suddenly decide, oh yeah, no more water is going back downstream, and that's just leaving out the environment entirely, because the fish probably want that water too. So yeah, it's a little more complicated when you're not on the coast and your discharge isn't the ocean. So
yeah, because if you're on the coast, you are the last on the bottom of the prior appropriation. You could probably keep whatever comes through, right?
Right. And it's not that we should also deprive estuaries, because we've got some very productive estuaries that need some of that water too. So you do have to be careful, but it's just, it's just easier if there's no other water right holder depending on that return flow. So
I would like to ask you some questions, though, about the agribusiness aspect. So one of the things that I've seen, at least in the Central Valley of California, over time, over the last 10 years, well, we can now expand this to 15 years. So since about 2010, we've seen a massive change from high water use, low margin crops to, well, now even less farming, but high margin crops, which, well, some of them use a lot of water, like almonds, but they're still high margin, right? So you could deal, you're willing to pay the money for that water and to pump that water out using electricity, right? for these more high margin crops. And the question is like, is there a way that we can maintain an agricultural base in the state of California and manage our water appropriately rather than just continue to see it decline, because they are pumping from the ground. And at some point, those aquifers in the ground are going to run out.
Right. Yeah. I think that's where the let the market control it all philosophy tends not to work so well. California legally lagged behind most of the Western states in getting a handle on its groundwater. We're still implementing the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and not a whole lot of control has gone on even yet. And we're paying the price. So if you have unsustainable agriculture to begin with, and a depleting aquifer resource, then yeah, you've got to think through a little more carefully what you're growing with that water, because it becomes precious. But again, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that no one has really wanted to grapple with, because no one wants to meddle. Well, no one wants to meddle with farmers, first of all, politically, but also don't want to get into meddle with quote unquote the free market. But, I would rather see that precious water going to a high value, high protein, vegetable protein crop that really is high value food, as opposed to all the water we spend growing alfalfa that we then ship to other places.
To Saudi Arabia and China. Yeah.
Yeah, right. And Saudi Arabia and China, and a lot of the water is going with it.
Yeah.
So again, I think it's a problem where money would help a lot, but if you could provide incentives to farmers to use water more efficiently, drip irrigation or hydroponic, and to grow crops that you were really getting food value out of that water, we would have a much more rational system. And we would potentially have a lot more water to go around. But that starts to sound like central planning, doesn't it? It's got to
be done very carefully. So
Yeah.
Here's a question. I teach this case, business case, which I love in our food program. We have a food program also. It's been running for 60 years at the USC Marshall School of Business. It's mainly agribusiness companies that come, but it's called Wolf Farming, and WOOLF. The Wolf family has a lot of acreage. I think one of the daughters is now in charge of this water marketplace. So they've been in California, I think, agricultural politics for a long time. But one of the interesting things about this case is it talks about the two different types of water rights that some farmers have. Some of them have federal water rights due to the Bureau of Water Reclamation when they built the canals and the water, and others have the state water rights. And what's interesting is the federal water is highly subsidized, very low cost. Right? But they prohibit any type of trading of that water. So essentially, it's like you use it or you lose it. And one of the thoughts I always had is, what if the federal government changed that and allowed them then to sell that water? So if they didn't actually have a good beneficial use of it, they could then put it on the market and sell to somebody else who could then put it to a good use, rather than just wasting all this water that they're getting at a very cheap price.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the whole complicated addition of the Bureau of Reclamation to all of this, because Bureau of Reclamation projects are authorized by Congress, and they can have pretty specific parameters in what the Bureau of Reclamation can and cannot do with that water, on top of which, in a bizarre twist of reverse federalism, the Bureau of Reclamation, when it completes the project, gets the water right from the state. So it's the Bureau of Reclamation holding a state of California water right, subject to whatever the California State Water Resources Control Board conditions got put on the water right, subject to whatever conditions Congress put on the reclamation project, subject to a duty that eventually the project would be paid for by the people under contract with the Bureau of Reclamation. So those are slightly different water rights because they're contractual water rights rather than from the state. And yeah, that can hamstring getting a little creative because you now got a double layer of bureaucracy over those water rights. And literally in some cases, it would take an act of Congress to be able to free that up. And water projects, not always Congress's high priority these days, and getting things through Congress has not been the easiest of late. So, that's a potential solution, but they are federally subsidized, and that is one of the subsidies that every once in a while people think about should be re-looked at. In 1902, at the time of the Reclamation Act, Congress was most interested in making the West livable, settlable, and you needed that major investment of federal money to get these water projects built, because it wasn't going to happen at the local level, and in most states it wasn't going to happen at the state level either. But the goal was that eventually the federal government would get paid back. But then we get these really low water rates, so they're not getting paid back really. And the water, because it is so heavily subsidized, is not valued as much as it probably should be. So yeah, it's a whole nother layer of complication on dealing with water in the West, is the Bureau of Reclamation and the many, many, many federal statutes involved in those reclamation projects.
Yeah, and then another thing to add to that, because as I was learning more about from these cases I teach, and either these water districts as well, and then the water districts also by state law might prohibit the trading from outside of the district. So you may have a surplus, or there may be price differentials between a district, and also we have the federal, it's really low. But unfortunately, we really don't have a water marketplace actually working in this state. And I think if we actually had one, we would use beneficial use of it, because you'd be paying the price of what it was worth. It means you'd only be using it on the land and the crops that you believe are the highest value. And you'd use it carefully because you're directly paying for it. You're not subsidized. It's a real market rate. Is that a state law that could be passed to allow districts to start maybe marketing water outside or between them?
Possibly. Water markets get to be really interesting legally, because if you're moving the water from one use to another, you're going to have to do a transfer of the water right, which involves something called the no injury rule. So it means whatever you're doing with the water in the new location, you can't injure any of the people who had water rights in the old location. And as a pragmatic matter, in the states that have water markets that are heavily dependent on return flows, so you're kind of at the limit of water use to begin with, it's really hard to move the use of water any distance that's going to disrupt that dependency on return flow and get through the rule. So you kind of have to have an excess of water to begin with to make it work. And like I said, the state could find ways to loosen that up, but then when you've got the federal overlay, you'd have to get Congress and the state legislature of California to come up with something that works for both systems, and that could be a massive lift. And plus, like I said, you don't want to be, we already move a lot of water around in California. We spend a lot of energy moving water around in California, and encouraging the movement of even more water across long distances in California maybe isn't optimal either. So, and like I said, we've kind of left aquatic ecosystems out of this conversation, but that's an important consideration too, is you don't want all the water going for human use. So some other critters need it too.
Yeah, it sounds like it's very complicated and cannot just easily be solved by saying, hey, we're all just going into a statewide market. There are a lot of moving parts. I do have another question then on this moving the water, because one of the things that at least the agribusinesses that I've worked with and done research in the past, they've all been behind former Governor Jerry Brown's idea of moving northern waters of California across the Delta and to the south, right? It was this idea of building either pipelines that go under it or you could do over it. It never happened, though that was always his goal to have it done, right? The idea of moving excess surplus water up north where they get a lot of rain to maybe the southern parts. What do you think might be holding that up now? Is it just political will? Is it the environmentalists who don't want a pipeline going underneath or above? Or what do you think?
Oh, the California Bay Delta is such an interesting water issue. Part of it is just the massive undertaking of building the pipeline. So it would be an environmental headache 5 ways from Sunday. You'd have to go through the California Environmental Quality Act certification. You'd have to do a federal National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statement. You're going to have endangered species issues, which is why they want the new pipeline to begin with, because of all the things going on with the Delta smelt,
the Delta
the
smelt.
orcas, and and it's going to be really expensive. And I think one of the increasing hesitations is everyone says, oh, the north of California's got all this excess water. Well, maybe, but maybe we build this thing in 10 years from now, they don't have all that much excess water in the north. So I mean, it's a massive undertaking, and you do raise the tensions that have always existed north to South California of why does Southern California get all our water?
Wait, we have the most population down here, right?
Yeah, well, voting, yeah, but it makes perfect sense voting wise. So I think it will probably get done, is my read on where that project is. But it's like I said, it's a massive undertaking in a time when we know water availability is changing. And
that's a good point. I never thought about the uncertainty of like weather patterns moving forward. Can we always rely on having more water in the northern parts of the state of California? That is a good question.
And like I said, to the extent that it helps the endangered species in that area, great. But then we're just, we're still not living sustainably in Southern California. We're still relying on a lot of imported water coming in. You've got salmon populations in the northern part of the state. You've got tribes that have vested interests in the northern part of the state, and it gets to be pretty complicated pretty fast.
Okay, so I've got another question now, maybe pivoting back to the Colorado that I think I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. So the state of Utah has been investing in this massive pipeline project to take their full share of the northern Colorado River because they've had massive growth. Companies moving there, people are moving there, especially the southern part, St. George area of Utah, Washington County. So they want water down there, which would be perfect from the Colorado River. And I guess in this last infrastructure bill, Senator Mitt Romney was able to get a $50 million earmark to help move this project forward. What will be the impact, assuming this, I believe it is going to come into operation in the next few years. When this happens and Utah hits their full amount that they have under the 1922 compact, what result will this have, I guess, on the states at the lower tier, like California and the lower river?
Well, it's an interesting question. I just moved here from Utah, and that is a political hot potato in Utah as well. But the quick and dirty answer is that states at the lower end, and California in particular, for years were relying on the upper basin states, and Utah in particular, not being able to use its full share. So you're at the end of the pipe. The good part of that is when nobody else is taking water out, it's like, hey, okay, it's all excess. We'll rely on it. So California legally has already had to cut back its use of the Colorado River as the other states are starting to come more online. I think at one point California was at 4.8 million acre feet per year, and legally we're only entitled to 4.4 million acre feet per year. So to some extent, that reality has already happened. That California was told, enough already, stop taking more than what you're legally entitled to. But the other point, and this is a point of interpreting the Colorado River Compact, is the most natural reading of the Colorado River Compact is that although in general, the upper basin and the lower basin are each entitled to 7.5 million acre feet per year on average, 10-year rolling average, that it's the upper basin that has to bear the brunt of any shortage. So now, like I said, that hasn't been fully tested yet because it hasn't had to be fully tested yet. But like I said, one reading of that compact is if push comes to shove, the lower basin gets its full 7.5 million acre feet per year plus half of Mexico's share from the upper basin, regardless of what that does to the upper basin. So
if our water flow then drops to say 10 million acres a year, right, which is right from 15, which is likely where it's trending, right, then they would still get the 7.5, leaving only 2.5 for the upper, for them to somehow, I guess, share.
Like I said, that is one reading of the compact. We have not gotten to the point, and that's what those two huge reservoirs are supposed to do, is make sure we never had to get to that point.
Yeah.
But I suspect if it got that distorted, some renegotiation or act of force would realign the balance, but or some court would interpret the compact to not mean that that the two basins had to share the shortage more or less equally. And actually there were several people in Utah in this pipeline project that said, Utah would be better off to just lease that water to California and get some money out of it, and use the water or use the money to do some water conservation work in Utah itself that would make the pipeline unnecessary. So there's the argument that way as well. But yeah, that's an interesting showdown moment for the Colorado River Compact, is if the lower basin states ever decide to insist on that interpretation of the compact. Now, from friends I know who represent their states in the Colorado River negotiations, mostly the states don't want to get to a showdown moment. So they think everyone will be better off if the money that would go to litigation and the angst and the public bad will and whatnot could be avoided, and they work out either a new deal or an interpretation of the old deal that avoids that shutdown moment.
And that's because it'd be like an original jurisdiction that goes right to the Supreme Court because it's between the states, and then when they make a decision, it could just fall down. Someone might lose, and that would be it, right?
Yep. Yeah, and this isn't even an equitable apportionment, which the Supreme Court doesn't like to do. This would be a compact interpretation, which it does all the time. And so, yeah, I don't think anyone wants to roll the dice on the Supreme Court. So, but like I said, that's the legal argument. And if you're California, that's one reason why California has been a little more recalcitrant. If you're California and you've got that legal argument in your back pocket, maybe you don't play quite as nicely as you would otherwise do. So yeah, it's interesting. But yeah, the Utah pipeline is an interesting development for many reasons. One view is, Nevada's got its pipeline, Colorado or Arizona got a pipeline, New Mexico's got a pipeline. It's time for Utah to have its pipeline. One worry in Utah is if they continue not to use the water, then if things come down to a break point, that's the easy place to make the adjustment. It's like, well, you didn't need
That's
it
right.
anyway.
Because there was no beneficial use, right?
Right.
That's an argument they could make.
Right. So yeah, there's a lot going on with that pipeline, but it, like I said, also raises this larger compact interpretation point. So, and I will say, as a legal scholar, I can tell you what I think the most natural reading is, but I can also make you the argument the other way. So it's one of those, you really would be flipping a coin going to the Supreme Court, especially since the equities would be against the most natural reading. So
Where does all of this conflict between states leave agricultural and energy markets? What's happening right now is these states are trying to deal with the fact that we have dwindling water supplies and they can't seem to agree on who gets what and how much.
Oh, yes. So what we're seeing now, I can tell you right now what we're seeing in agribusiness and agriculture in California and Arizona. So we're seeing more and more of the produce that's lower margin move to Mexico, to the northern states right here across, it's just south of Arizona. They're moving down there. And I expect to see that trend continue to move forward. More and more agriculture from Arizona as well as California moving to Mexico, leaving with us only with those that have the federal water rights that get it really low, or have some like water right that they have, and they can continue to produce, you say, almonds or some sort of high margin product food. So it's going to see more specialization in California of particular crops. And then a lot of the produce continue to move south of the border. That seems to be the biggest trend moving forward. And, this is a problem because we know in Central Valley, the produce is where like the employment occurs, right? You need the workers to pick. And this is why the Central Valley has double-digit unemployment. It's been that way for the last 4 years because of the drought.
So Sean, I'm curious, when you say lower value crops, are we talking lettuce? I mean, what specific crops are we talking about?
Yeah, I mean, lettuce works, that's extremely low because it's like you're talking about the weight and volume of it and how much you could sell it for. Yes, and it requires a lot of labor hours to cut. You can't really mechanize the cutting the lettuce without destroying it. So leafy greens for sure. Tomatoes, maybe, but a lot of that can be mechanized depending if you're going to make paste out of it. So the more almonds are 100% mechanized now, right? So that you could do, and there's a huge market for it and the demand continues to grow. So the margins on almonds, because of the mechanized nature of harvesting, is quite high. Yeah, so that's how we can think about that. And we could use that with all the different crops. Now, strawberries, a lot of those are grown by the coast, right? In Ventura County and Santa Barbara. And so they have different water issues than like the Central Valley, what we've been mainly focusing on. They're like reservoir caught and down in the areas there in terms of like their water. She knows, because you studied at Santa Barbara, right, Robin? Is that right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So you're familiar with that. And I think that's going to continue to do fine there. They seem to have enough water for the strawberries, and the price is rising, but they're making it work. So, but in terms of the Central Valley, this is where I see things moving, unfortunately, until we could figure out, like we discussed today, a better water market that allows for beneficial use allocation.
Right. Well, I'm curious though, because and this goes to my, if we could get a large infusion of cash and transition some of the farming operations. I mean, both tomatoes and leafy greens do well with hydroponics too, which, from everything I understand, it takes a large investment to get it up and running. But once it's up and running, it's like closed loop cooling systems for power stations. You only need a little bit of a new infusion of water after the initial getting it up and running. So in the long term, it saves you a lot of water, but it is a pretty high initial upfront investment. Does that sound right?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. In fact, what is the name of that those little cherry tomatoes, that company that makes
SunGold?
is it Sun Gold maybe? They come in this little container like this. Oh gosh.
Yeah, I
check.
know the one you mean. Yeah, they always look so pretty sitting on the shelf.
That's right. That's right. Anyway, they are using this technology in Mexico and in Arizona. It's an Israeli technology, which they know how to farm in the drought
Yeah,
conditions.
right.
Right. Where they
A
have
lot
these,
to learn from Israel.
that's right, drip irrigation within these actual greenhouse that are quite automated, where they can pick the tomatoes automatically, water them, take care of them. They grow in this area. So this is like the future, and like we're seeing in Arizona, where they have a bigger water drought issue than California. And they've had to adapt if they wanted to grow and do agriculture in Arizona. And also in, well, Mexico, they're just thriving down there because the labor rates are so low, but they're also adopting this Israeli technology in Mexico because they have less water down there.
Right,
So
right.
it's working out well for them. And I as soon as I get the name of this company, it's going to come to me real soon. I'll say what it is.
And while you look for that, I want to jump in with another question. So Mexico is, according to the 1922 compact, as I understand it, supposed to get 1.5 million acre feet per year annually. Is that correct?
Well, not under the compact, but yeah, under the treaty we have with Mexico, it's 1944.
Okay. And they are not getting that 1.5 each year from us, or are they?
They get it more regularly now than they used to. Let's put it that way. We've had several what are called minutes to the treaty to improve relations with Mexico. So part of the problem at one point was even when Mexico got its water, it had been run through so many farms and other systems that it was highly salinated. So it really had to be desalinated before they could use it. So the United States agreed to treat the water before it goes into Mexico. We had a really good moment. Mexico had part of its water system destroyed. And so that was the moment that the United States said, hey, we can store some of it for you in Lake Mead. You can call on it when you want it. We'll help you rebuild your infrastructure. So I would say our relationship with Mexico has been improving over that water, and it more reliably gets water it can actually use. But when you have a system-wide emergency drought, there are also provisions, the drought emergency provisions for the Colorado River that allow that delivery to Mexico to be reduced in light of the drought. So yeah, it's a complicated and long-term relationship, but like I said, the bright side is it's gotten better over time.
And Sean, can you contextualize all of that within agribusiness and just the US and Mexico's current relationship around?
Well, I got the name of the company.
Okay.
NatureSweet.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It's a San Antonio-based company, operations in Mexico and in Arizona. And they're the ones who use, excuse me, it wasn't Israeli, it's a Dutch actual technology they're using. It's a Netherlands technology. But anyway, I'm sure I think they also said they use it in Israel, but it's developed by the Dutch. Yeah, so this is NatureSweet. I believe their operations are not fed by hold on. Yeah, they're further down in southern Mexico. So down in Jalisco, the state of Jalisco, right? And where they have much more water availability rather than right across the border, say in Mexicali. So they're not affected by like any Colorado River drawdowns or lack of water. And that's what we're actually finding among the produce companies in California too. If they want to continue to stay in it, they'll set up operations in southern central Mexico where there is this water that's not conditional upon Colorado water.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcast.usc.edu.